Thomas McClure woke up to the same silence he had heard for 3 long years. No voices, no laughter, just the wind whistling through the gaps in his cabin walls. At 26 years old, he had never kissed a woman, never held hands with anyone, and sometimes wondered if he ever would. His life was simple but hard, just him, his cattle, and the endless Wyoming wilderness. Every morning started the same way. Thomas would roll out of his rough wooden bed, pull on his worn boots and step outside to check on his animals. The nearest person lived 15 miles away, and the small town of Cedar Ridge was a full day's ride through dangerous mountain passes. Most folks thought he was crazy for living so far from civilization, but Thomas had his reasons. His father had been a drunk who beat his mother and left them with nothing but debt and shame. When Thomas finally saved enough money to buy this land, he promised himself he would be different. He would work hard, stay clean, and build something real with his own 2 hands. The loneliness was the price he paid for that promise. The ranch itself was nothing fancy. Thomas had built the cabin himself, log by log, during his first brutal winter here. The roof leaked when it rained hard and the door stuck in the cold months, but it was his. He had 40 head of cattle that he had bought with every penny he owned. They were good animals, hardy enough to survive the harsh winters that killed weaker stock. His daily routine never changed. Wake up, feed the animals, check the fences, repair whatever was broken, and try to ignore the silence that pressed in from all sides. Sometimes he talked to his horse, Buck, just to hear a voice, even if it was his own. Buck was a patient listener, standing still while Thomas shared his thoughts about the weather. The cattle, or his worries about the coming winter. Thomas had learned to do everything himself. He could fix a broken fence, deliver a calf, treat sick animals, and cook simple meals that kept him alive. His hands were rough and scarred from the work, but they were strong hands that could build and fix and provide. He was proud of what he had accomplished, even if there was nobody around to see it. The winters were the hardest part. Snow would pile up so high that Thomas couldn't see his barn from his cabin window. He would be trapped inside for days at a time with nothing but his own thoughts for company. He had a few books that he read over and over again. The Bible his mother had given him, a book about farming, and an old novel about adventure on the high seas. Sometimes he would read passages out loud just to break the silence. Food was basic but filling. Thomas grew vegetables in a small garden behind his cabin and preserved what he could for winter. He hunted deer and rabbits when he needed fresh meat, and his chickens provided eggs. Every few months he would make the long trip to Cedar Ridge to buy supplies like flour, coffee, and ammunition. The people in town treated him politely but kept their distance. They thought he was odd for choosing to live alone so far from everyone else. Thomas had no mirror in his cabin, but he knew what he looked like from glimpses in the water barrel on clear days. His brown hair had grown long and shaggy, and his beard covered most of his face. He was tall and lean from the hard work, with blue eyes that had seen too much loneliness. His clothes were practical, sturdy pants, flannel shirts, and boots that could handle any kind of weather. At night, Thomas would sit by his small fire and listen to the sounds of the wilderness. Coyotes howling in the distance, owls calling from the trees, and sometimes the heavy footsteps of a bear passing through his property. He had gotten used to these sounds, but they reminded him every day that he was alone in a place where nature made the rules. He had built his life carefully, like constructing a fence one post at a time. Every decision was planned, every resource was precious, and every day was a small victory against the forces that wanted to break him down. Thomas had no idea that his carefully ordered world was about to change forever. That a single act of kindness would bring consequences he could never imagine. The isolation had made him strong but also cautious. He trusted his own judgment because he had no choice. When problems came up, and they always did, Thomas had to solve them himself. A sick cow, a broken water pump, a roof that needed patching before the next storm. These were the challenges that filled his days and gave his life purpose. Some evenings, especially in summer when the air was warm and the sky was clear, Thomas would sit on his front porch and watch the sun set over the mountains. These were the moments when the loneliness hit him hardest. He would think about the life he might have had if he had stayed in town, found a wife, raised children. But then he would remember his father's angry voice and his mother's tears, and he would know he had made the right choice. Thomas slept with a rifle by his bed, not because he was paranoid, but because he was practical. Bears, mountain lions, and sometimes desperate men passed through his land. He had never had to shoot anyone, but he had scared off his share of trouble over the years. The gun was just another tool, like his hammer or his plow, something that helped him survive in a place where weakness could get you killed. His hands told the story of his life, calloused from rope and wood, scarred from barbed wire and broken. Tools stained from working with leather and metal. They were the hands of a man who had built his world from nothing and defended it against everything nature could throw at him. These same hands, gentle enough to help a newborn calf take its first steps, would soon reach out to help a stranger in need, changing everything he thought he knew about himself and his place in the world. The October evening air was crisp and clean as Thomas rode Buck home from the northern pasture. He had spent the day fixing a section of fence that the wind had knocked down during the last storm. His back ached from bending over fence posts, and his hands were raw from handling barbed wire, but the work was done. All he wanted now was a hot meal and a warm fire. Buck's hooves made a steady rhythm on the hard ground as they approached the cabin. Thomas was thinking about the coming winter and whether he had enough hay stored up for his cattle. The first snow could come any day now, and once it started, there would be no more chances to prepare. He was so lost in his thoughts that he almost missed her. At first, Thomas thought it was just a bundle of old clothes someone had dropped near his well. But as Buck got closer, the bundle moved slightly, and Thomas felt his heart jump. He pulled the reins and slid down from his horse, approaching carefully. What he saw made him stop in his tracks. A young woman lay crumpled on the ground, her long black hair spread around her like a dark fan. She was wearing a dress made of soft deerskin, decorated with beautiful beadwork that caught the last rays of sunlight. But the dress was torn and dirty, and the girl looked like she had been traveling for days without food or water. Thomas had never seen a Native American woman up close before. He had heard plenty of stories in town about raids and attacks, about settlers who disappeared and were never found again. The folks in Cedar Ridge would tell him he was crazy for even thinking about helping her. But looking down at this young woman, probably no older than 16, Thomas saw only someone in desperate need. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from thirst. Her face was pale under her brown skin, and her breathing was shallow and quick. She was unconscious, but every few seconds she would mutter something in a language Thomas had never heard before. The words sounded urgent, like she was trying to tell someone something important. Even in her sleep, Thomas knelt beside her and gently touched her shoulder. Her skin was hot with fever, and when she opened her eyes for just a moment, they were unfocused and confused. She looked at him without really seeing him, then closed her eyes again. Thomas knew he had to act fast. She was dying of thirst and exhaustion, and if he didn't help her soon, she wouldn't survive the night, but helping her meant putting himself in danger. If other settlers found out he had brought a Native American into his home, they might think he was working with the tribes against his own people. And if her people found out he had touched her, they might see it as an attack and come for revenge. Thomas stood there for a long moment, torn between fear and conscience. The decision came to him when he heard her whisper something that sounded like water in broken English. The word was barely audible, but it was enough. Thomas couldn't walk away from someone who was dying of thirst, no matter who she was or where she came from. His mother had raised him better than that. Moving as gently as he could, Thomas slipped his arms under the girl and lifted her up. She was lighter than he expected, probably because she hadn't eaten in days. Her head fell against his shoulder, and he could feel how hot her skin was through the deerskin dress. Buck snorted nervously as Thomas approached with his unexpected burden. But the horse stood still while Thomas figured out how to get them both into the cabin. Thomas managed to push open his cabin door with his elbow and carry the girl inside. His cabin had never felt smaller than it did at that moment. There was his bed, his table, his chair, and his fireplace. Where was he supposed to put her? After a moment of hesitation, Thomas laid her down on his own bed, the only soft place in the cabin. He would sleep on the floor if he had to. The girl's breathing was getting more shallow, and Thomas knew he needed to get water into her as soon as possible. He had a bucket of clean water by the door, and he quickly filled a cup and brought it back to the bed. Kneeling beside her, he carefully lifted her head and tried to get her to drink. Most of the water ran down her chin at first, but then she seemed to sense what it was and started swallowing in small sips. Thomas was patient, giving her just a little at a time so she wouldn't choke. After she had drunk about half the cup, her eyes opened again, and this time they focused on his face. The fear in her eyes was immediate and intense. She tried to sit up and pull away from him, but she was too weak to move very far. Thomas held up his hands to show he meant no harm and spoke in the calmest voice he could manage. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe. I found you by my well. You were dying of thirst." She stared at him with wide, dark eyes, clearly trying to understand his words. Then she said something in her own language, speaking quickly and urgently. Thomas shook his head to show he didn't understand, and she tried again, this time mixing in a few English words. "Home," she said clearly. "Need ... Thomas nodded. "I know you want to go home. But right now, you need to rest and get your strength back. You're very sick." She didn't seem to understand all of his words, but his tone seemed to calm her a little. She let him help her drink more water, and when he brought her a piece of bread, she ate it slowly, as if she hadn't tasted food in days. As the evening wore on, Thomas found himself in a situation he had never imagined. He had a young Native American woman in his cabin, and he had no idea what to do next. He couldn't take her to town. The people there would either panic or get angry, maybe both. But he couldn't just put her back outside to die either. So Thomas did what he always did when faced with a problem. He focused on what needed to be done right now. The girl needed food, water, rest, and medical care. Everything else could be figured out later. He built up the fire to keep the cabin warm, heated some soup he had made earlier, and prepared to spend a very long and uncertain night wondering what tomorrow would bring. Thomas spent the first night sitting in his wooden chair, watching the girl sleep and listening to every sound outside his cabin. Every crack of a branch or hoot of an owl made him wonder if someone was coming to look for her. He dozed off a few times, but never for long. By morning, his neck was stiff and his eyes were burning from lack of sleep. The girl woke up as the sun was rising, and this time she seemed more alert. She looked around the cabin, taking in the rough wooden walls, the simple furniture, and Thomas sitting nearby. Her dark eyes were still cautious, but the wild fear from the night before was gone. She tried to sit up and winced, putting a hand to her head. "Slow," Thomas said, holding up his hand. "Take it slow. You hit your head pretty hard." She looked at him for a long moment, then pointed to herself and said something in her language. When Thomas looked confused, she tried again, speaking more slowly. "Ayana," she said, touching her chest. "My name." "Ayana." Thomas smiled and pointed to himself. "Thomas, my name is Thomas." "Thomas," she repeated, and he was surprised at how easily she picked up the pronunciation. "Thomas help Ayana." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, and Thomas could hear the gratitude in her voice even though her English was limited. He nodded and pointed to the water cup. "Drink," he said. "You need water." Over the next 2 days they developed their own way of talking. Ayana knew more English than Thomas had first thought, probably learned from traders or missionaries who had visited her people. She could understand simple words and phrases, and she was quick to learn new ones. Thomas found himself speaking more slowly and clearly than usual, using his hands to help explain what he meant. On the second morning, Ayana was strong enough to sit up and eat a proper meal. Thomas had made porridge with honey, and she ate it carefully as if she was still getting used to the taste. After breakfast, she pointed outside and said something in her language that sounded urgent. "What is it?" Thomas asked. "What do you need?" Ayana looked frustrated for a moment, then got up and walked to the door. She pointed outside and then back at herself, then made a gesture like she was walking. "You want to go outside?" Thomas asked Dot. She nodded eagerly. Yes, outside, show Thomas. Thomas followed her out of the cabin, wondering what she wanted to show him. Ayana walked over to a patch of bare dirt near his well and knelt down. Using a stick, she began to draw in the dirt. Thomas watched, fascinated, as pictures began to take shape. First, she drew what looked like mountains. Then she added trees and a river. She pointed to the drawing and then to herself. Home, she said. Ayana, home. Thomas nodded. This is where you're from? Ayana continued drawing. She added small circles that Thomas realized were supposed to be teepees or houses. Then she drew two figures, one tall and one short. The short one had long hair like hers. Grandmother, she said, pointing to the tall figure. Ayana, grandmother. She made walking motions with her fingers, showing the two figures moving away from the village. Then she drew what looked like men on horses, and her face grew dark. She made harsh sounds and violent gestures, and Thomas began to understand what had happened. Men attacked you, Thomas said quietly. Bad men. Ayana nodded sadly. Bad men, white men. She looked at Thomas carefully when she said this, watching for his reaction. Thomas felt a sick feeling in his stomach. He had heard stories about groups of men who attacked Native American families, sometimes for money, sometimes just for the cruelty of it. These men gave all white settlers a bad name and made the tensions between the two peoples even worse. Ayana continued her story in the dirt. She showed how she had hidden while the men hurt her grandmother. She drew herself running away, then getting lost in the wilderness. The pictures were simple, but they told a clear and heartbreaking story. I'm sorry, Thomas said, not sure if she would understand. I'm sorry that happened to you. Ayana looked at him with surprise. She seemed to understand his tone even if she didn't know all the words. She reached out and touched his hand briefly, then smiled for the first time since he had found her. Thomas, good man, she said, not like bad men. Thomas felt something warm spread through his chest at her words. He had been so isolated for so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone trust him. To see goodness in him, Ayana pointed to the mountains in her drawing and then to the real mountains visible in the distance. Home. There, she said, far, very far. Thomas studied the drawing and tried to match it with the land he knew. Based on the way she had drawn the mountains and rivers, her home was probably somewhere to the northwest. Maybe near the Black Hills? That was dangerous territory, where the army and the tribes were constantly fighting over land and gold. 30 miles? Thomas asked, holding up 3 fingers and then making a walking motion. Ayana shook her head and held up more fingers. More, much more. Thomas felt his heart sink. 30 miles would have been dangerous enough, but if her home was farther, then getting her there safely would be almost impossible. The area she was describing was filled with men who would shoot first and ask questions later, on both sides. But as he looked at Ayana's hopeful face, Thomas knew he couldn't just tell her to leave and hope for the best. She would never make it home alone, especially not in her weakened condition. And winter was coming fast. If she got caught in a snowstorm, she would freeze to death. That afternoon, Thomas got out his simple maps and spread them on his table. Ayana studied them with interest, running her finger along the lines that showed rivers and mountain ranges. She pointed to an area that made Thomas's blood run cold. It was deep in territory that was claimed by both the government and the Lakota Nation, which meant it belonged to neither and was controlled by whoever was strongest. Dangerous, Thomas said, shaking his head. Very dangerous for me to go there. Ayana looked at him with understanding in her eyes. She knew what she was asking. She knew that helping her could cost Thomas his life. But she also knew that without his help, she would never see her family again. That evening, as they sat by the fire eating dinner, Thomas made his decision. He had been alone for 3 years, living a safe but empty life. Maybe it was time to take a risk for something that mattered. Maybe it was time to do something brave. Tomorrow, he said, looking at Ayana, tomorrow we go home. You're home. Ayana's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. Thomas good, she said again. Thomas very good man. Thomas just hoped he was brave enough to be the man she thought he was. Thomas woke up before dawn on the third day, his stomach tight with nerves. He had made the decision to help Ayana get home, but now that morning was here, the reality of what he was about to do hit him hard. He was going to ride into territory, where both sides would shoot him on sight. Carrying nothing but hope and a young woman's directions drawn in the dirt, he had packed carefully the night before. Food for 3 days, water, ammunition, his rifle, and a few basic supplies. Everything had to fit in his saddlebags because they would be traveling fast and couldn't afford to carry extra weight. Thomas had also given Ayana some of his spare clothes, a shirt and pants that were too big for her but would help her blend in from a distance. Ayana was already awake when Thomas started moving around the cabin. She had been quiet the night before, and Thomas could tell she was thinking about her family, wondering if they were still alive, if they were looking for her. She helped him pack without being asked, moving efficiently despite her recent injuries. "Ready?" Thomas asked as he finished checking his rifle. Ayana nodded, but he could see the worry in her dark eyes. "Dangerous for Thomas," she said quietly. "Maybe Thomas no come. Maybe Ayana go alone." Thomas shook his head firmly. "No, we go together. Or nobody goes." They led the horses out of the barn in the gray light before sunrise. Buck was nervous, sensing Thomas's tension, while the second horse, a Mare named Belle, seemed calmer. Thomas had chosen Belle for Ayana because she was gentle and steady, good for someone who might not be used to riding. "We travel when sun low," Thomas explained, pointing to the horizon. "Early morning, late evening, hide during day." Ayana understood immediately. Yes, hide from bad men. Both sides have bad men. They rode north from Thomas's ranch, staying away from any paths or roads that might be watched. The land was rough and rocky, with deep canyons and thick forests that could hide them but also slow them down. Thomas had to trust Ayana's sense of direction, because once they left the area, he knew she would be their only guide. For the first few hours, they rode in nervous silence. Every sound made them both jump, a bird taking flight, a branch snapping. In the wind, the distant howl of a coyote. Thomas kept his rifle across his lap, ready to use it at the first sign of trouble. Ayana rode beside him, her eyes constantly scanning the landscape around them. As the sun climbed higher, Thomas started looking for a place to hide during the heat of the day. Ayana pointed to a narrow canyon ahead of them, almost invisible from the main valley. They led their horses down a steep, rocky path that was barely wide enough for the animals. The canyon was perfect, deep enough to hide them completely, with a small stream for water and grass for the horses. Thomas and Ayana set up a simple camp, but they didn't dare light a fire, even though the air was getting cold. "How do you know about this place?" Thomas asked quietly as they shared some dried meat and bread. Ayana smiled slightly. "Grandmother. Teach Ayana, read land like book, water always flows down. Animals make paths, wind tells stories." Thomas had never thought about the wilderness that way. To him, it was just empty space to cross as quickly as possible. But as Ayana pointed out different signs, the way certain plants grew near water, how animal tracks could lead to safe passages, the meaning of different bird calls, Thomas began to see the land through her eyes. "That bird," Ayana said, pointing to a hawk circling overhead. "He sees something move. Maybe men, maybe just deer. We wait." They crouched in the shadows for almost an hour, watching and listening. Eventually, the hawk flew away, and Ayana nodded that it was safe to relax. "You learned this as a child?" Thomas asked. "Yes, all children learn. Must know land to live on." "Land?" Ayana looked at Thomas curiously. "White men no learn this." Thomas shook his head. "Most white men try to change the land instead of understanding it." They talked quietly through the afternoon, and Thomas was amazed at how much Ayana knew about surviving in the wilderness. She could tell which plants were safe to eat, how to find water even when there was no stream visible, and how to read the weather by watching clouds and feeling the wind. As evening approached, they prepared to continue their journey, the second. Part of their ride would be the most dangerous, because they would be entering territory that was actively disputed. Thomas checked his weapons one more time and made sure their water containers were full. From here we must be very quiet, Ayana warned. This land angry, much fighting, much blood. They rode out of the canyon as the sun was setting, painting the sky orange and red. The beauty of the sunset seemed wrong somehow, too peaceful for the dangerous ground they were covering. Thomas could feel the tension in the air, as if the land itself was holding its breath. About 2 hours into their evening ride, Ayana suddenly held up her hand and brought her horse to a stop. Thomas pulled up beside her, his heart pounding. "What is it?" he whispered. Ayana pointed ahead to a ridge line about half a mile away. Thomas squinted in the fading light and saw what she had spotted, tiny figures moving along the ridge. They were too far away to tell if they were soldiers or native warriors, but either group would be bad news for Thomas and Ayana. They quietly led their horses into a grove of trees and waited. The figures on the ridge moved slowly, like a patrol. Checking the area, Thomas counted at least 8 men, all on horseback, all carrying weapons. After what felt like hours, the patrol moved on, disappearing over the ridge. "Army," Ayana said quietly, "looking for my people." They waited another hour before continuing, taking a route that would keep them far from the ridge where the patrol had been. The moon was rising now, giving them enough light to see, but also making them more visible to anyone else who might be watching. As they rode through the night, Thomas found himself thinking about how different this journey was from anything he had ever done. For 3 years, his biggest worry had been whether his cattle had enough grass to eat. Now, he was risking his life to help someone he had known for only 3 days, riding through land where death could come from any direction. But, looking at Ayana riding beside him, her face determined and hopeful despite the danger, Thomas knew he was doing the right thing. She had trusted him with her life, and he would not let her down. Dawn was approaching when Ayana pointed to another hiding spot, an old prospector's cave that was partly hidden by fallen rocks. They would rest here during the day and continue tomorrow night. As Thomas unsaddled the horses, he realized they were now deep in no man's land, with enemies on all sides and only each other to rely on. The third day of their journey started differently than the others. When Thomas woke up in the old prospector's cave, he could smell smoke in the air. Not the clean smell of a campfire, but something heavier like burning grass and wood. Ayana was already awake, sitting at the cave entrance and staring out at the horizon with a worried expression. "What is it?" Thomas asked, moving to sit beside her. "Smoke," she said, pointing to a thin gray line rising in the distance, "from home direction." Thomas felt his stomach drop. Smoke could mean many things, and most of them were bad. It could be a normal cooking fire, or it could mean the village was under attack. There was no way to know from this distance, but Thomas could see the fear in Ayana's eyes. "We need to move faster," she said, standing up and starting to pack. Their few belongings. Thomas wanted to tell her to be careful, that rushing could get them killed, but he understood her urgency. If her family was in danger, every minute counted. They saddled their horses quickly and headed out even though the sun was still high in the sky. The landscape began to change as they rode toward Ayana's homeland. The trees grew taller and thicker, and Thomas could see mountains rising in the distance that looked different from the ones near his ranch. These mountains seemed older somehow, more sacred. Ayana's whole body language changed too. She sat straighter in her saddle and seemed more alert, like she was finally getting close to familiar ground. "There," she said suddenly, pointing to a cluster of trees on a hillside. "Sacred markers, we close now." Thomas looked where she was pointing, and saw what appeared to be small bundles tied to tree branches. They were too far away to see clearly, but Ayana explained that they were prayer offerings, left by her people to mark the boundaries of their traditional territory. "From here, very dangerous for Thomas," she said, turning to look at him with serious eyes. "My people see white man, they think enemy. Maybe shoot first, ask questions later." Thomas had been expecting this moment, but it still made his mouth go dry. Everything he had heard about Native American warriors suggested that they were fierce fighters who showed no mercy to enemies. And he would definitely look like an enemy, a white man with a rifle, riding into their sacred territory. "What do we do?" he asked. Ayanna thought for a moment, then started removing her outer shirt, one of Thomas's old shirts that she had been wearing over her deerskin dress. Underneath, her traditional clothing was clearly visible. "Ayanna ride first," she said. "Thomas stay back. When they see Ayanna alive, maybe they listen before they shoot." It was a risky plan, but Thomas couldn't think of a better one. They rode forward slowly, with Ayanna about 50 yards ahead of Thomas. The tension was so thick Thomas could barely breathe. Every shadow could hide a warrior with a bow and arrow. Every rustling bush could be someone getting ready to attack. Then Thomas heard something that made his blood freeze, the sound of hoofbeats, coming fast from multiple directions. Within seconds, they were surrounded by a dozen young Native American men on horseback. They appeared so suddenly and quietly that Thomas wondered if they had been watching for miles. The warriors were painted for battle, with feathers in their hair and weapons ready. Their horses danced nervously, sensing the tension in the air. Thomas had never felt so exposed and vulnerable in his life. One word from any of these men, and he would be dead before he could even reach for his rifle. But then Ayanna called out in her own language, and everything changed. The warriors' expressions shifted from hostility to shock, then to something like joy. They recognized her, and Thomas could hear the relief and excitement in their voices as they spoke rapidly in their native tongue. One of the warriors, a young man about Thomas's age, rode up to Ayanna and spoke to her with obvious emotion. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but he could see tears in the young man's eyes. This was probably her brother or cousin, someone who had been looking for her and feared she was dead. Ayanna spoke quickly, gesturing toward Thomas several times. The warriors kept looking at him with suspicion and confusion. Thomas could guess what she was telling them, that he had saved her life and helped her get home. But he could also see that some of the warriors were not convinced that any white man could be trusted. After several minutes of heated discussion, the group started moving toward the village. Thomas found himself in the middle of the group, with warriors on all sides watching his every move. Their eyes never left him, and Thomas knew that one wrong move would be his last. As they rode over a small hill, Thomas got his first look at Ayanna's village, and it took his breath away. There were dozens of teepees arranged in a large circle, with smoke rising from cooking fires and people moving about their daily activities. Children were playing games, women were working on various tasks, and men were tending to horses. It looked peaceful and organized, nothing like the wild, dangerous place Thomas had imagined. But as soon as the villagers saw the approaching group, everything changed. Women grabbed their children and hurried them inside the teepees. Men reached for weapons and formed a protective line. Dogs started barking and horses neighed nervously. Within minutes, what had been a peaceful village became an armed camp ready for battle. The sight of a white man in their village was clearly shocking to everyone. Thomas could see fear, anger, and confusion on the faces around him. Some people were pointing at him and speaking rapidly to each other. Others were just staring, as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Ayanna called out to the crowd, and Thomas heard her say his name several times. She was telling her story, explaining how Thomas had found her and helped her get home. But Thomas could see that many people were not ready to listen. The tension in the air was so thick he could almost taste it. Then an older man emerged from one of the larger teepees, and the crowd fell silent. This was clearly someone important, probably a chief or council leader. He was tall and dignified, with gray hair and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of wisdom and hard decisions. When he looked at Thomas, it felt like he was looking right through him, reading his soul. The old man listened as Ayanna told her story, asking questions in their language and nodding thoughtfully at her answers. Thomas noticed that several other older men had joined the group, forming what was obviously the village council. These men would decide his fate. As the discussion continued, Thomas became aware that more and more people were gathering around them. He estimated there were at least 200 people in the village, and every single one of them was watching him. Some faces showed curiosity, others showed hatred. and a few showed something that might have been respect. Thomas sat quietly on his horse, trying not to make any sudden movements that might be seen as threatening. He had come this far by trusting Ayana, and now he had to trust that her people would see the truth of what had happened. His life was literally in their hands. The old chief studied Thomas for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. His weathered face showed no emotion, giving Thomas no hint about what he was thinking. The silence stretched on until Thomas could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Around them, the entire village waited to see what would happen to the white man who had dared to enter their sacred space. Finally, the chief spoke. His voice was deep and calm, but Thomas could hear the authority in every word. Even though Thomas couldn't understand the language, he knew this was a man who was used to making life and death decisions. The chief gestured for Ayana to come closer, and she slid down from her horse to stand before him. What followed was the longest conversation of Thomas's life, even though he couldn't understand a single word. Ayana spoke rapidly, using her hands to help tell her story. Sometimes she would point to Thomas, sometimes to herself, and sometimes to the horizon where they had come from. The chief listened carefully, asking questions that made Ayana think. Before she answered, the other villagers began to gather around them in a large circle. Thomas noticed that they stayed back respectfully, but their eyes never left him. He could see mothers holding their children close, young warriors with their hands near their weapons, and elderly people whispering to each other. Everyone wanted to know what was going to happen. An old woman pushed through the crowd, moving faster than her age should have allowed. When she saw Ayana, she cried out and rushed forward, wrapping the young woman in her arms. Thomas realized this must be Ayana's grandmother, the one she had been traveling with when they were attacked. The old woman was crying and touching Ayana's face, as if she couldn't believe her granddaughter was really alive. Through her tears, the grandmother spoke to the chief, and Thomas could hear the emotion in her voice. She kept looking at Thomas while she talked, and he caught a few English words mixed in with her native language. Words like good man and saved her and brought her home. Thomas felt a small spark of hope. If Ayana's grandmother was speaking for him, maybe he had a chance, but not everyone seemed convinced. A group of younger warriors had gathered to one side, and Thomas could see anger in their faces. One of them, a man about Thomas's age with scars on his chest, stepped forward and spoke harshly to the chief. Thomas didn't need to understand the words to know what the warrior was saying. No white man could be trusted. Thomas was probably a spy, and he should be killed before he could bring soldiers to attack the village. Other voices joined in, some supporting the angry warrior and others defending Thomas. The peaceful village had turned into a heated debate, with people taking sides and arguing passionately. Thomas sat on his horse in the middle of it all, knowing that his life hung in the balance of this discussion. The chief raised his hand, and immediately everyone fell silent. He spoke a few words, and several men came forward, clearly the village council. They formed a circle and began what was obviously a formal discussion about Thomas's fate. Thomas watched their faces, trying to read their expressions, but these were men who had learned to hide their thoughts. As the council talked, Thomas found himself thinking about his life. 3 days ago, his biggest worry had been whether he had enough firewood for winter. Now he was sitting in a Native American village, surrounded by people who had every reason to hate him, waiting to find out if he would live or die. It seemed impossible that helping one lost girl could have led to this moment. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the village when the council finally reached their decision. The chief stood up and looked directly at Thomas. When he spoke, his voice carried to every person in the village. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but he could feel the weight of them. This was a formal judgment delivered with all the authority of tribal law. Some people in the crowd nodded approvingly, while others looked disappointed or angry. Thomas still had no idea what had been decided. Then a middle-aged man stepped forward from the crowd. He was dressed differently from the others, in clothes that mixed native and white styles. When he spoke, it was in clear English with only a slight accent. "I am Joseph," the man said to Thomas. "I learned your language from missionaries." The chief has asked me to speak his words to you. Thomas's mouth was so dry he could barely speak, but he managed to nod. Joseph continued, Chief, Standing Bear says that his granddaughter has told him of your kindness. She says you found her dying and gave her your own bed, your own food, your own water. She says you risked your life to bring her home, asking for nothing in return. Thomas felt a wave of relief, but Joseph wasn't finished. But, Joseph said, and Thomas's heart sank again, there are many in this village who have lost family to white men. Many who have seen their children killed, their homes burned, their sacred places destroyed. They say that one act of kindness does not erase a lifetime of pain. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Thomas could see Ayanna standing with her grandmother, both women watching him with worried expressions. The council has debated for many hours, Joseph continued. Some say you should be killed as payment for all the wrongs done by your people. Others say you should be kept as prisoner to prevent you from telling soldiers about this village. And others say you should be honored for your courage and kindness. Thomas's legs felt weak, and he gripped his horse's reins tighter to steady himself. Joseph looked at the chief, who nodded for him to continue. Chief Standing Bear is a wise man who has led this people through many troubles. He remembers when his own grandfather made peace with white traders who showed respect for our ways. He also remembers when other white men broke every promise they made. The tension in the air was so thick that Thomas could barely breathe. Every eye in the village was focused on him. The chief has decided, Joseph said finally, that you have shown honor in bringing his granddaughter home safely. You could have left her to die, but you chose to help. You could have left her at the edge of our territory, but you chose to bring her all the way home, even knowing the danger to yourself. Thomas felt tears stinging his eyes, though he wasn't sure if they were from relief or continued fear. But, Joseph said, and Thomas's heart stopped again, the chief also knows that your presence here puts this entire village at risk. If soldiers find out that you were here, they might think we captured you. They might attack us to rescue you, even though you came here freely. Thomas realized that his act of kindness had created problems he had never even thought about. By bringing Ayanna home, he had put her entire people in danger. The chief spoke again, and Joseph translated his final words. You will be escorted safely away from here, but first, there is something that must be done. Something to make sure that you are protected and that we are protected. Tomorrow you will understand. Thomas barely slept that night. The village had given him a place to rest in a small teepee with 2 guards stationed outside. They weren't exactly prisoners, but they weren't exactly protectors either. Thomas lay on a buffalo hide, staring up at the smoke hole in the center of the teepee, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The chief's words kept echoing in his mind. Tomorrow you will understand. When dawn broke, Thomas could hear activity throughout the village. Voices calling back and forth, horses neighing, and the sound of many people moving around with purpose. It sounded like the entire village was preparing for something big. Thomas sat up and looked through the teepee opening, but the guards gestured for him to stay inside. About an hour after sunrise, Joseph came to get him. The translator's face was serious but not unfriendly. It is time, he said simply. Chief, Standing Bear wishes to speak with you. Thomas followed Joseph to the center of the village where an amazing sight waited for him. Hundreds of warriors were gathered in the main area, all dressed in their finest clothing. Their faces were painted with traditional designs, and they wore feathers and ornaments that caught the morning sunlight. Their horses stood nearby, also decorated with colorful blankets and feathers. Thomas had never seen so many Native American warriors in one place. Each man looked strong and proud, and their weapons were clearly visible, bows, lances, and some rifles. It was both beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Chief Standing Bear stood in the center of the gathering, wearing a magnificent headdress that marked him as the leader. When he saw Thomas, he began to speak in his native language. His voice was strong and carried to every person present. Joseph translated quietly for Thomas. The chief says that you have done something that has never been done before. A white man has entered our sacred territory not as an enemy but as a friend. You risked your life to save one of our children, asking for nothing in return. Thomas felt uncomfortable being the center of so much attention. He had never thought of himself as particularly brave or special. He had just done what seemed right at the time. The chief continued speaking, and Joseph translated. But your kindness has created a problem for both of us. If you return to your people and tell them about this village, soldiers might come. If, you say nothing, other white men might think we captured you and killed you. Either way, there could be war. Thomas began to understand why so many warriors were gathered. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about preventing a conflict that could destroy both communities. So, Joseph continued translating, the chief has decided to do something that will protect you and protect us. You will be escorted home by these warriors, but not as a prisoner. You will ride with them as a guest of honor, under the protection of the entire tribe. Thomas looked around at the sea of painted faces and felt his knees go weak. 300 warriors were going to escort him home? It seemed impossible, like something from a dream or a story. The chief spoke again, and Joseph's translation made Thomas's head spin. This escort will serve many purposes. It will show your people that you came here as a friend, not a captive. It will show our enemies that we are strong and united. And it will mark you as under our protection forever. Ayanna appeared at Thomas's side, smiling despite the serious atmosphere. She had been cleaned up and was wearing a beautiful dress decorated with intricate beadwork. She looked like a princess from one of the adventure books Thomas read during long winter nights. Ayanna grateful, she said in her careful English. Thomas save Ayanna life. Now, tribe save Thomas life. The logistics of moving 300 warriors were staggering. Thomas watched in amazement as the village organized itself with military precision. Within an hour, every warrior was mounted and ready to ride. They formed into columns that stretched far beyond what Thomas could see clearly, Chief standing. Bear rode up to Thomas on a magnificent black horse. Through Joseph, he explained the plan. We will travel slowly, so that anyone watching will have time to see what is happening. We want no confusion about why we are in white territory. Thomas was given a place of honor near the front of the procession, riding between the chief and several elder warriors. It felt strange and overwhelming to be treated with such respect by people who had every reason to consider him an enemy. As they began to move, Thomas realized this was unlike any journey he had ever taken. The warriors rode in perfect formation, their horses stepping in rhythm without any visible signals. The only sounds were the soft thudding of hooves on grass and the occasional call of a bird overhead. The silence was profound and meaningful. 300 men and horses moving across the landscape without conversation, without casual noise, creating an atmosphere that felt sacred. Thomas began to understand that this was more than just an escort. It was a ceremony, a ritual that carried deep meaning for everyone involved. As they rode through the morning, Thomas caught glimpses of the countryside around them. Small settlements in the distance, lone travelers who stopped and stared in amazement, and once a group of soldiers who watched from a hilltop but made no move to interfere. The message was clear to anyone who saw them. This was not a war party, but something much more significant. The discipline of the warriors was incredible. They rode for hours without breaking formation, without speaking, without showing any sign of fatigue. Their faces remained serious and focused, as if they were participating in the most important event of their lives. Thomas found himself thinking about the incredible honor being shown to him. These men were warriors who had fought in battles, who had lost friends and family to conflicts with white settlers. Yet they were treating him with the highest respect their culture could offer. By midday, they had covered more ground than Thomas usually traveled in a full day alone. The warriors seemed to know exactly where they were going, following routes that Thomas had never seen before. They moved across the landscape like they owned it, which in many ways they did. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas began to recognize landmarks near his own ranch. They were getting close to home, but he realized that his life would never be the same after this day. He was returning as a different person than the one who had left, no longer just a lonely rancher, but someone who had been marked by an entire tribe as worthy of their protection and respect. The sun was beginning to set. When they finally reached familiar territory, Thomas could see his cabin in the distance, looking small and insignificant compared to the magnificent procession that surrounded him. Tomorrow he would wake up in his own bed, but tonight he was part of something larger than himself, something that would change both his life and the lives of everyone who witnessed this incredible day. Thomas woke up in his own bed for the first time in 4 days, but something felt different. The silence that had been his constant companion for 3 years was gone, replaced by an awareness that he was no longer truly alone as he lay there. In the gray light before dawn, he could almost feel eyes watching him. Even though he knew the warriors had left during the night, he rolled out of bed and pulled on his boots. The same routine he had followed for 3 years, but when he opened his cabin door and stepped outside, Thomas stopped dead in his tracks. His heart nearly stopped beating, and for a moment he wondered if he was still dreaming. 300 Lakota warriors sat motionless on their horses in perfect formation around his homestead. They were arranged in concentric circles like ripples, spreading out from his cabin. Their faces were painted for ceremony, not war, but the sight was overwhelming enough to make Thomas's legs feel weak. The warriors had arrived sometime during the night in complete silence. Thomas had heard nothing. No hoofbeats, no voices, no sound at all. It was as if they had materialized out of the morning mist like spirits from another world. They sat perfectly still, their weapons visible but not threatening, their eyes focused but calm. Chief Standing Bear sat on his black horse directly in front of Thomas's cabin, about 50 feet away. When he saw Thomas emerge, the chief raised his hand in greeting but did not speak. The silence was so complete that Thomas could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. Slowly, carefully, Thomas walked toward the chief. Every step felt heavy with meaning, as if he was crossing some invisible line between his old life and whatever was coming next. The morning air was crisp and clean, and Thomas could see his breath as he moved closer to the mounted figure who had changed his life forever. When Thomas was close enough to speak without shouting, Chief Standing Bear began to talk in his native language. His voice was strong and clear, carrying easily across the quiet landscape. Though Thomas couldn't understand the words, he could hear the respect and solemnity in the chief's tone. Joseph, the translator, rode forward from somewhere in the formation. Thomas hadn't even seen him among the other warriors, but suddenly he was there, ready to bridge the gap between two very different worlds. Chief Standing Bear says you have shown great honor, Joseph translated. You took our lost daughter into your home when you could have turned away. You fed her from your own table and gave her your own bed. You risked your life to bring her safely home, asking for nothing in return. Thomas felt heat rising in his cheeks. He had never thought of his actions as particularly heroic. He had just done what seemed right at the time, the chief continued, speaking, and Joseph translated each word carefully. In our culture, such kindness creates bonds that cannot be broken. You are no longer a stranger to the Lakota people. You are family now, and family protects family. Chief Standing Bear reached into a leather pouch hanging from his saddle and pulled out something that made Thomas catch his breath. It was an eagle feather, but not just any feather. This one was decorated with intricate beadwork and small pieces of silver that caught the morning light. Thomas knew enough about Native American culture to understand that eagle feathers were sacred, given only to those who had earned the highest respect. This feather marks you as a friend to all Lakota people, Joseph translated as the chief held the feather toward Thomas. Wherever you go, whatever happens, this feather will tell our people that you are under our protection. Thomas accepted the feather with trembling hands. It was heavier than he expected, not just physically but emotionally. He was holding something that represented honor, courage, and acceptance from people who had every reason to hate him, but the chief wasn't finished. His expression grew more serious, and when he spoke again, his words carried a warning that made Thomas's stomach tighten. There is danger coming, Joseph translated. Other white men in this territory have noticed your absence. They are asking questions, spreading stories about you helping Indians. Some say you have betrayed your own people. Thomas felt cold fear creeping up his spine. He had been so focused on helping Ayana and surviving the journey that he hadn't thought about how his neighbors might react. In a territory where tensions between settlers and tribes were already high, being seen as friendly with Native Americans could be deadly. "There are men who would kill you for what you have done," Joseph continued, translating the chief's words. "They see kindness to our people as treason to yours. This is why we are here." Thomas looked around at the 300 warriors surrounding his property. Suddenly their presence made perfect sense. This wasn't just a ceremony or a gesture of respect. This was protection, a clear message to anyone who might be watching. Chief Standing Bear spoke again, and his words made Thomas realize how completely his life had changed. "Anyone who brings harm to you brings harm to the entire Lakota nation," Joseph translated. "This message will spread to every white settlement within 100 miles. You are no longer just Thomas the rancher. You are Thomas the friend of the Lakota, and that makes you both safer and more dangerous than you were before." The chief reached into his pouch again and pulled out a small piece of decorated leather with symbols painted on it. He handed it to Thomas along with the feather. "This is a safe passage token," Joseph explained. "If you ever need to travel through Lakota territory, show this to any of our people and they will help you. If you are ever in danger from your own people, bring this to any of our villages and we will protect you." Thomas stared at the objects in his hands, trying to process what they meant. In the space of 4 days, he had gone from being a lonely rancher that nobody cared about to being under the protection of an entire nation. It was overwhelming and terrifying and wonderful all at the same time. The sun was climbing higher now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Chief Standing Bear spoke one last time, and Joseph's translation carried the weight of a final blessing. "You showed us that not all white men are our enemies. You proved that kindness can exist between our peoples, even in times of hatred and fear. This day will be remembered in our stories for generations to come." The chief raised his hand again, and suddenly the morning silence was broken by a sound that Thomas would never forget. 300 warriors began chanting in their native language, their voices joining together in a song that seemed to make the very air vibrate with power and emotion. The chanting continued for several minutes, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Chief Standing Bear nodded once to Thomas, then turned his horse and began riding away. The other warriors followed in perfect formation, moving like a single organism across the landscape. Within minutes they were gone, leaving only hoofprints in the grass and the memory of the most extraordinary morning of Thomas's life. He stood alone in front of his cabin, holding an eagle feather and a piece of decorated leather, knowing that his days of isolation were over forever. Thomas McClure had woken up that morning as a lonely rancher. He would go to sleep that night as a man who had bridged 2 worlds with nothing but kindness, forever changed by the simple act of helping someone in need.